I have 15 minutes and 44 slides.
Yeah.
No, don't worry, we'll skip. I didn't know how much time I have, and there's lots of content, but
No, you pay for the food.
hey, we're sitting through 44 slides. Okay, so yes, I work for Greenshoot Labs, and so does Tim and Stu, and we're very excited because this is the first time we're talking about OpenDialog, which is a conversational management platform slash framework slash toolkit and so on. It will get clearer as we go along. So what we do at Greenshoot Labs is, it started out just as looking at conversational interfaces and what would be interesting to do. And these days, mostly, it's about enterprise automation and how chatbots kind of behind the scenes, not necessarily directly interacting with the consumer, can automate processes in the enterprise. So some examples, we built a checklist bot on Slack that lets you create checklists and manage tasks with your team and cooperate and collaborate, and it reminds you when the appropriate things to do. This is going to be interesting. We did a chatbot that is about helping startups to get to figure out how to solve their problems. Something about fighting cybercrime. It's called the Cyber Helpline, and you essentially go to it and describe the attack that you just had, whether it's phishing or scam or whatever, and it tries to help you. Something that's surprisingly exciting is automating audits for large international accountancies. And this is interesting because it's a combination of a chat interface and just more kind of traditional application elements to it. And yeah, what we're most famous for is the AI Football Manager, which was a tiny project we did to talk about Alexa and engineering for kids and so on, and the press picked it up and it became football managers are gone, AI is taking over the world, and yeah, we try to keep it sane, but the press is impossible to handle. Bit about my background, so it's kind of software engineering, digital products. I did a PhD in something called multi-agent systems, which is distributed AI, so it's when you have multiple things that are autonomous and goal-oriented and so on, and are trying to coordinate to solve problems. And that's where kind of few of the ideas around OpenDialog came from. 15 minutes, I have to keep this in mind. So, what are we going to talk about? The conversational landscape, kind of what are the different tools that people use to build chatbots, where OpenDialog fits and what problems it's trying to solve. And the intro to OpenDialog will be very brief because I could spend hours there and it's probably not a good idea.
No.
Right, so before I get into it, how many of you would call yourselves chatbot builders, makers? Okay, and how many of those are kind of on the programming side of things versus the designing side of things? Okay, interesting. And the rest of you are, how many are looking to build a chatbot? Okay. So, chatbot landscape is really interesting because it's early days, like said before, and we're at the top of the pyramid, but it's already expanding. Like this is the amount of different types of tools and so on. So at the very low level, you have your machine learning and NLP type tools. Then that increasingly gets closer to the semantic level. What is the intent of something someone said? That then gets bundled into conversations, so kind of flows of intents. and that then gets into an actual solution, so that end-to-end thing, right? And to the side of it, you have how on earth do we design these things, how do we optimize them? And where OpenDialog fits is that T-type thing. So we think about how you manage conversations, and we plug into the lower level stuff. So whether it's Google NLP or Amazon Lex or Watson and so on, we leave that open-ended and just provide integrations. And we think about conversation flow, design optimization, and you can use that to build the end-to-end solution for your specific domain. Right? So that's kind of where we are, where we're trying to be in the world, I guess. The problems we're trying to solve, and let me know when I have 5 minutes left, and it's not now. Builders of chatbots, is anyone willing to offer up what is their biggest pain right now? Just
I'm working on a chatbot I've been writing from scratch. And the big pain for me is the parser, because I have to spend so much time improving the parser.
Okay.
Working out the grammatical structure of the sentence to pass that data on to the program.
right. Cool. Anyone else?
I was going to say, understanding intent, especially when people write differently.
Mm-hmm.
Sarcasm.
Sarcasm.
It doesn't make sense.
Okay. Okay, so that's kind of on the low end of the NLP aspects of it, trying to train things.
It would be really nice to be able to design a chatbot without ever having to use anything other than my voice.
That's interesting. It's actually, I'm trying not to get distracted, but I think what we're going to need is intelligent tools to build these things, because there's too much complexity and we can't keep it in our head. So unless we have the tools that are going to help us kind of synthesize that and summarize it, it's going to be hard to evolve this. Okay, so some of the problems we're trying to look at, and these are things that we came across as we were building the chatbots I described, and I'll go quickly through this, is first of all, how do we even design conversations? Like, what language do we use to describe what we're trying to do? And if you do a quick search on Google, you'll find stuff like this. So map out your conversation in some sort of organizational diagram or decision tree type thing, or do this, go crazy with post-it notes, or is this sort of stuff. And this is what I really like about the field. Like, none of this ways is wrong, just people are trying to figure it out, right? But we still don't have that common language, which for web design, if you think of it, or mobile application design, is much clearer. So that's one of the issues. Then the other issue is, as the teams grow, and you have your conversational design experts and your developers and your product managers and so on, how do they work together? How do they collaborate? How do the tools facilitate that? One, just to give you an example of how early we are in this space, IBM and Google only just recently announced that they are able to handle versioning of conversations, and they're doing it in a very basic way. So you can take snapshots and then you can load them back in, type of thing. So unless your team actually builds a way to manage this, it's very difficult to scale this in an enterprise setting. And it's particularly hard when you're dealing with CTOs that are used to mature software development methodologies, and then the chatbot people come in and they say, well, how do you do deployment? And it's like, what do you mean? You change the text or something. So it's this sort of things that we're trying to deal with. In terms of NLP tooling and so on, it's about how do we allow you to choose the best thing for the problem at hand. And what's really interesting is, quite often within a single application, you might want to use a number of different tools because each tool does something different well. So for example, with a cyber helpline example, the cybercrime chatbot that I talked about, we use Google NLP for the low-level decomposing of a sentence into its individual components, but then we use our own kind of semantic knowledge graph type thing to figure out what the intent is, because that's a more complex custom thing that we wanted to do. Another thing that's really kind of one of my favorite problems to solve is where chatbots don't exist in isolation. It's not just about conversation, it's conversation and action, and the two things interrelate. And there are reams of academic research about how do you tie the two things together. So how can we bring that into a tool that just lets you use it? And finally, and again, this I guess partly is something that we care about personally, but it's important to lots of different organizations for lots of different reasons, is owning your platform and owning your data. Right? So I talked about the accounting bot. If you're a Swiss accounting firm, you do not want audit data to be traveling over to Google Cloud to be analyzed at the NLP level and so on. You want open source tools that you can keep on premise and manage yourself, and then tie that to the rest of the conversational platform. Definitely not doing that. So OpenDialog, how much time?
7.
Doing really well. Don't worry about it. Okay. I like this point, so you're getting it. We talk about chatbots, right? In the same way that we talk about websites, I guess, but there's lots of different types of websites, and there's lots of different types of chatbots. And what we're trying to solve specifically with OpenDialog is conversational applications. Right? So these are things that are more task-oriented. It's not about maintaining a believable conversation and tricking the other person that that's a human or it's somehow a very intelligent thing. You're trying to solve a problem. You want to buy something. You want to have an experience, and you're not just testing. It's not the Turing test. You're not trying to pass that. That's like a different problem to solve. The way we approach it, in order to give ourselves some sort of conceptual grounding, is saying, okay, in the multi-agent systems world, for decades, we have been working on problems of what does it mean to try and achieve a goal? What does it mean to cooperate with someone else to solve a problem? How can you share information that will lead you towards a goal? How can you coordinate, negotiate, argue? Like, for all these things, there is research to help us solve it. And so when we are modeling conversational applications, we view every single entity, humans included, as agents. We're all just part of one system trying to solve a problem. It's just that one part of the system is a bot, the other one is a human being or human beings, or bots and human beings, and so on. And more specifically, if you have time and want to look into this, the approach we're taking is something called an electronic institution. And I'm definitely not going to spend time on that, just talk about the high-level concept. So a conversation is something that has a specific goal. We're trying to buy something, we're trying to create a task, we're trying to figure out what's going on with a project. There's a number of people and bots involved in it, and we have ways to model all of that. There's actions that take place, and there's a state, right? So it could be something like, I want to create a checklist. There is some sort of checklist creation action that goes out and talks to some API and actually does the thing that I want it to do. And there's a state that is evolving as the conversation evolves, right? So that's kind of the high-level unit. And then the electronic institution theory and abstractions, and it gets really detailed, like it goes into very formal logic about how all these things interact, just gives you a way to group different conversations together and define the relationships between them. And then conversations themselves are actually graphs of interactions. And again, because of time, I'll just go straight into, so this is what a conversation would look like. You have different scenes, so it's different phases of the conversation. And the best way to think of this, the abstraction is that of a theater play. You have different acts of a play. If you think of going to a restaurant, right, that's a set of different scenes. There's the first scene where you go in and you say, hello, I'd like a table for two. Do you have a reservation? No, we don't. Get lost. You know, it's kind of that first play, and then it's where would you like to seat? That's the next scene. Here are your menus. What would you like to order? And you just step through this play. And that's what an institution means. Like a restaurant is an institution. This meetup is an institution. I come up here, I talk, my time runs out, I have to go. You know, and that's what we model with these things. There's more detail there, that's why there's 2 slides, but I'll skip that. So as you build out, so you kind of start with your conversation saying, I want to deal with the restaurant thing, I want to deal with person walking into a hotel room, right, and what's going to happen. I define my conversations and the state at different times. Then I go into my scenes and I define the exchanges within scenes, right? And then I tie all that together, and that graph just keeps growing. So what OpenDialog does is provide you with a way to build all of that, run it, and reason over it, right? And then you'll tie it into your enterprise backend systems and APIs, and to actually get actions done, right? More specifically, because it's a graph, we actually use a graph database to store this. It's something called dgraph, which is a great tool that not a lot of people know about. If you know about graph databases, you probably used Neo4j, right? dgraph was built by the same person that built Google's knowledge graph. And it's an amazing piece of software, so look into it. So we store everything in the graph, and as conversations evolve, we store the evolution of those conversations within the graph as well. So then that lets us do analysis over what actually happened for different users, what do flows look like, and again, there is a whole set of research that you can look at to see how you can extract data about relationships between things in a graph format and figure out what's going on with your chatbot, right? At a more practical level, in terms of actually describing this for a tool, the first thing we did is define a YAML representation of it. So this is literally just a text file, right? So it's saying there's a scene, there's some intents, there's a user and the bot, and they're exchanging intents. And through this thing that gets increasingly more complicated, you can do lots of interesting things, and you just have to take my word for it. But you can do things like, if a piece of information is missing, take the user off to another scene and figure out what that information is, transition back to your original scene, keep doing that. And because we can stack these scenes and we can kind of take things off the stack, go to something else and come back, we don't lose context. Right? So we're keeping context throughout, and you can do increasingly more complicated things through this. And there's also, within this you can also define your actions, and it's simplifying what the graph structure would look like, so you can go ahead and do it quickly. Skip that. Okay, and the last thing I really want to talk about is we separated intent from the actual text, the actual utterance, right? So when you're describing your scenes, you will say things like create new tasks. So that literally means the user said, create a new task for me. The way the user said that is the actual utterance. that needs to go through an interpreter. So you can tell OpenDialog what interpreter to use to figure out that intent. And you can have different interpreters per intent. And some of them are going to be very complicated, but some of them can just be a string parser. So you can kind of adjust what you need. Then, in the same way, sorry for going up and down and making it dizzy, the bot in the conversation representation replies with an intent. So we don't have the actual text the bot is going to say here. What OpenDialog is going to do is say, right, the bot wants to say, here is your task report. It's going to go to a message store. It's going to look at context and say, right, I need to say this in Slack for this user over this period of time and so on. Now I'm going to construct the actual message and send it. So you have your conversation flow and structure over here, and you have your messages, the actual text that goes back and forth, in and out, somewhere else, right? And it's all about making the problem smaller to deal with, right? So conversations, scenes, intents, utterances, NLP is lower than that, and so on. It's just breaking the problem, kind of standard engineering, so that you can actually solve it. Let's not do that. We definitely not do that. Okay, we're done. Congratulations.